Good evening, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. It's wonderful to see all of you in this beautiful auditorium. My name is Jaap Jansen, and I'm program maker at Studium Generale. Welcome to this Holocaust Memorial Lecture, which is organized on the occasion of Holocaust Memorial Day, on which we commemorate those who have suffered and who have died during the Holocaust, during World War II. And Holocaust Memorial Day is on the 27th of January, so that's not today, but it's Friday. And this is the day on which the largest concentration camp was liberated by the Red Army in 1945, namely Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I'm very pleased and truly honored to have a very special guest speaker, and that's Professor Dan Stone. Thank you for coming to Maastricht all the way from London. I'm very, very happy to have you here because you were supposed to give this lecture in 2019 already, but then due to circumstances, we had to cancel the lecture. So you are for 4 years on my list already, so finally I've got you here. And Dan Stone is a professor of modern history and director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London. Strange sounds. His research interests range from the history of fascism to the history of genocide, and even, but not really nowadays, the theory of history. He has written a host of books, nearly 20, he told me during dinner. And of course, the one recently published, or it has to be launched on the 31st of January. And that was the book that stood at the base of this lecture, called The Holocaust, An Unfinished History. And The Guardian, it was, according to The Guardian, it was a brisk, compelling and scholarly account of the Nazi genocide and its aftermath. But he has, as I said, written a lot of books, to name but a few: The Liberation of the Camps, Goodbye to All That, The Story of Europe Since 1945, and The Historiography of Genocide. And tonight he will touch upon a number of aspects that of the Holocaust, of course, that maybe challenge some of the common assumptions that we might have. So, the lecture will take approximately 1 hour, and we will have half an hour for questions, and we will end this session at 9:30, more or less. Please give him a warm applause. Dan Stone, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Jaap, for the very kind introduction. And I'd like to thank you especially for inviting me a second time and forgiving me for having to cancel first time round. It's really a pleasure to be here in this beautiful setting, and my first time in Maastricht, and also a great pleasure, as always, in the Netherlands to be among people who can speak English properly. So hopefully this won't be too trying for you, despite the topic. So as Jaap said, my book, actually it's being published on Thursday. The publishers were never going to publish it after Holocaust Memorial Day. It was obviously going to come before, and the Dutch edition will be out next month. So there's a bit of advertising for you. So I'd like to start by reading a couple of quotations, just a couple of vignettes that I've drawn from the mass of material that we have about the Holocaust. The first one comes from Hannah Levy-Haas. In the diary that she kept in Bergen-Belsen, the young Jewish Yugoslav, Hannah Levy-Haas, writes at one point of a boy whose body has been infested by fleas and who is rejected by his family. She writes, "He couldn't kill the vermin that had settled on his body because he couldn't see them. They've burrowed deep into his skin and swarmed through his eyebrows. His chest is completely blackened by these fleas and their nests. We have never seen such a thing. We never imagined such a thing could occur. Everyone avoids him. His brothers and his sister dread his presence, his fleas, his howling. The other night, he dragged his useless body from one bed to the other, begging people to make room for him. Everyone pushed him away in disgust. Painful story. His case is not unique." The second one comes from this book, which if you haven't come across it, I recommend it. It's extremely tough reading. And these are stories written, so these are a fiction, but fictionalized accounts of things that the author had clearly seen in the Łódź ghetto. And in one of the stories in this book, the author, Isaiah Spiegel, describes a rabbi who at the morning prayers appears to go mad after having been mocked by German soldiers in the street. And he writes, "For a moment, Reb Bunem was paralyzed, overcome by shame and nausea. The blood rushed from his heart into his hands, which began to tremble. His eyes flashed an uncanny green flame. With a surge of preternatural strength, he suddenly turned to the praying Jews and started ripping the prayer books from their hands. The frightened Jews moved off to the side, while Reb Bunem continued tearing the psalm books from their grasp and casting imprecations on their heads. He shouted with the voice of one possessed, while in the darkness of the synagogue his beet-red face glowed with divine wrath. Jews, stop reciting psalms. God is on the side of our enemy. God is with the Germans. I beseech you, recite no more psalms. Our world is shrouded in darkness." A rabbi desecrates the holy books and pleads with his congregants to abandon their prayers. There is still a final example. There are still major parts of the history of the Holocaust that have not been understood in the prevailing narrative. In the region of Romanian-occupied Ukraine, which the Romanians called Transnistria, Here, Jews were herded into pigsties where they froze to death and suffered inescapable epidemics. They were not paid for the work they did, although payment was promised. They were robbed and often tricked into handing over valuables or clothing in exchange for food that was never provided. In Akhmechetka, and I quote, "Driven by hunger, most of the Jews were naked in a matter of weeks, covering their hips with rags or paper. The prefect, so the regional authority, Modest Isopescu, who preferred this camp over all other camps in the Golta Judets or county, inspected it a few times, each time amusing himself with the fate of the prisoners. He took pictures of the deportees grazing, as he put it, grazing in the grass on their hands and knees. In Pechora, extreme hunger quickly reduced the prisoners to eating plant roots, twigs, leaves, human excrement, and even dead bodies. Romanian and Ukrainian guards raped young Jewish women, who in turn killed themselves. Such conditions fostered mental illness and suicide." And I mentioned, part of the reason I mention this, I'll come back to it, is simply, first of all, because the history of the Holocaust in Romania remains very little known, I think particularly in the English-speaking world and in Western Europe more generally. And the places that I just named, Akhmechetka, Pechora, and others like it, Domanovka, Vapniarka, Bogdanovka, these are sites of some of the largest massacres of the Holocaust, carried out not by the Germans, but by the Romanians with Ukrainian auxiliary assistance. And they need to be incorporated into this history, I think. So to give, to come back to one of those places, Bogdanovka, which is about here on the River Bug, in what's today Ukraine. In December 1941, in Bogdanovka, the largest face-to-face massacre of the Holocaust took place. Babi Yar, near Kiev, is rightly famous as the site of a huge massacre carried out by the Germans on the 29th to 30th of September 1941. According to Einsatzgruppe C, so the action squad that followed the Wehrmacht as it invaded the Soviet Union and shot large numbers of Jews in the rear behind the troops, in their report, they claimed that 33,771 people were murdered in Babi Yar over those 2 days. One of the shooters, a man named Kurt Werner, recalled later that it's almost impossible to imagine what nerves of steel it took to carry out that dirty work down there. It was horrible. Yet at Bogdanovka, a place that no one has ever heard of, as many as 54,000 people, mostly Ukrainian Jews, were shot by Ukrainian auxiliaries under the control of Romanian gendarmes and the local prefect, Isopescu, who I already mentioned. The latter, Isopescu, pleaded with the governor of Transnistria, a man named Gheorghe Alexianu, not to send him another 40,000 yids when he had already had to find space for 11,000 yids in the state farm pigsties where there was not sufficient space for 7,000 pigs. Quite apart from the ritual humiliation of housing in inverted commas, housing Jews in pigsties, the creation of overcrowded ghettos and camps in Transnistria created a situation of starvation and disease where it made sense to the Romanians to exterminate the Jews like virus-infected farm animals. More Jews were murdered in massacres in Transnistria than were deported from the Netherlands. Yet places such as Bogdanovka, Akhmechetka, Domanovka and Vatniarka remain barely known in Western Europe and in the English-speaking world. The book that I've just shown you, one of the things that I tried to do in the book is to rectify this situation and to emphasize the extent of non-German collaboration in the Holocaust. It's perfectly clear that the events that we today call the Holocaust were driven by the leadership of the Third Reich and that most Jews were murdered by Germans, by which I include Austrians, obviously, because I'm talking about the Third Reich. Yet the case of Romania reminds us that regimes allied to Nazi Germany also participated. In that case, with minimal German involvement, and for similar reasons, to rid Romania of the threat supposedly posed to the Romanian race by the Jews. Other countries, notably France, Slovakia, and Croatia, initiated persecutory laws, deportations, and murders in advance of being ordered to do so by Nazi Germany. Yet others, such as the Netherlands, Norway, and Hungary, facilitated the Germans' plans by supplying bureaucracies and police forces to identify and round up Jews. The Holocaust was a Europe-wide crime, not only because the Germans occupied most of Europe, but because they found willing collaborators everywhere, from states to institutions such as police forces and individuals. And the case of Romania is one I particularly like to stress because the reason why the ghettos and camps were created in Transnistria was because the Antonescu regime originally intended to send the Jews that had been deported from Bukovina and Bessarabia, what's today basically the Republic of Moldova, had been deported from those regions to Transnistria, where the local Jews had also been killed, particularly the Jews of Odessa, very large Jewish community. And the Romanians intended to push them over the River Bug into German-controlled Ukraine, the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. And the Germans refused to take them. And so the Romanians basically dumped the Jews in what we call ghettos and camps, but in reality were mostly had previously been Soviet-era collective farms and other agricultural facilities. And the Jews were basically just dumped there and left exposed to the elements, where they died in huge numbers and then were shot in massacres as well. So the Romanian Holocaust was really, it took place under the umbrella of a German-led project, but it didn't involve the Germans, other than the Germans refused to take the Jews out of the Romanian hands. and so they dealt with them in their own way. It's a very striking case, I think, in the history of the Holocaust. So these vignettes, this story of a boy whose body is traumatized by kind of merging with the animal world, a rabbi who demands that his congregation rip up the holy books, these camps that don't feel like the camps we're familiar with in the Third Reich, take us a long way, I think, from the notion of industrial murder that still prevails in public consciousness. The vast majority of the Holocaust's victims were Eastern European Jews living in Poland and the Western Soviet Union, including the Baltic states, the former Pale of Settlement. More Jews were murdered from the city of Warsaw than from the whole of Western Europe. The numbers are staggering, but about 1.5 million Jews were shot in face-to-face killings in the autumn of 1941 and spring of 1942. The Nazis wiping out of whole communities in Eastern Europe means that we still don't even know the names of about 1 million of the Holocaust's victims. The Jews of Poland, who in the country's pre-war borders constitute half of the Holocaust's victims, were killed in massacres, in ghettos, where about 500,000 died of disease or were starved to death, or in the Operation Reinhard death camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Were it not for the deportation of the Hungarian Jews in the spring of 1944 and the dismantling of Treblinka in 1943, so that there was nothing left to see by the time the Red Army reached the site, that camp, i.e. Treblinka, would have been responsible for far more deaths than Auschwitz. These killings, from the Einsatzgruppen shootings of autumn 1941 to the Reinhard camps in 1942-43, make clear several things. First, the Holocaust had very little to do with the Nazis' regular concentration camp system, by which I mean the camps run by the SS's IKL, the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps. The Reinhard camps were outside of the purview of the IKL, and Majdanek, which was the coordinating center for the Reinhard camps, and later Auschwitz, were anomalous in the concentration camp system. And so the regular concentration camps, places like Dachau, Mauthausen, Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, were not Holocaust camps. I'll come back to that. And secondly, that the concept of industrial genocide only partly captures the horror of the Holocaust. So in the English-speaking world, we still tend to associate the Holocaust with concentration camps. The liberation of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen by the US Army, and Belsen by the British, has led to a confusion that has lasted decades. Jews were at those camps in the spring of 1945 because they had been marched there following the evacuation of camps further east to prevent the inmates falling into the hands of the Red Army. These so-called death marches, and I write about them at length in the book, saw about a third of the 714,000 registered concentration camp inmates in January 1945 murdered by the end of the war in May. But camps such as Belsen were not, strictly speaking, Holocaust camps until the last months of the war. Buchenwald held primarily political prisoners and so-called asocials. Jews were among them, but these were not camps that were set up primarily for the murder of the Jews. Auschwitz-Birkenau, as I've said, was an aberration in the history of the Holocaust, in the sense that most of the Jews killed in the Holocaust were dead by the end of 1942, before the gas chambers and crematoria at Birkenau were operating fully. And so our images of industrial genocide stem really from the spring of 1944, when the massive collaboration on the part of the Hungarian state, Adolf Eichmann's 200-strong commando deported most of the Jews of Hungary, some 450,000 of them. The Holocaust turned the victims' world upside down, not just destroying their homes and families, leaving most of the small minority of survivors unable to return to the lands of their birth, but in terms of values. Both during and after the war years, the Nazi assault on the Jews left them, in many cases, unable to lead lives guided by morality or established norms. That's what the example of the Łódź ghetto that I cited is intended to show. Those trapped in Nazi ghettos and camps found themselves not on another planet, the term that's sometimes used, but certainly in the anus mundi, the arsehole of the world, in which literal and metaphorical filth governed existence. These were places made by human beings in which human beings were destroyed. As Hannah Arendt said, perhaps the Holocaust was an attempt to eradicate the very concept of the human being. Her radical claim reminds us that we have in some ways either forgotten, if not ignored altogether, what the Holocaust was and how devastating its effects were. The depth of the trauma caused by the Holocaust means we must move beyond this mechanistic interpretation of industrial genocide. The ubiquity of collaboration across Europe, driven by a coincidence of wants between the Nazis' ideologically driven aspiration to rid the world of Jews and the desires of many nation-states leaders to create ethnically homogeneous populations, means we need to stop thinking of the Holocaust solely as a German project. It was driven and largely perpetrated by Germans, however, which means we also must focus on ideology, understood as a kind of phantasmagorical conspiracy theory, as the kernel of Nazi thinking and action. And finally, we need to understand the ways in which the after effects of the Holocaust shaped the post-war years and continue to be felt today. The trauma of the Holocaust has been largely written out of the historiography and decidedly excluded from commemorative ceremonies and the discussion of the Holocaust in the public sphere. Might seem a strange thing to say, and I'm not suggesting that people are not moved, I'm not suggesting that people are not well informed, or that they don't find the events terrible. But the real depths of suffering that the Holocaust caused, beyond the level of the individual or the family, and its deep implications for the nature of the modern state and the modern world in general, are just too unpleasant and uncomfortable for people to deal with, or so it seems. If you think about what happens at most commemorative ceremonies, I think they can be moving, they can be powerful, but they rarely address the really major questions that the Holocaust raises for the modern world. They focus on the sufferings of individuals and communities, and at that level it kind of stops. The problem is partly caused by vocabulary. So, as the scholar of Holocaust literature, Lawrence Langer, noted 30 years ago in his landmark study of Holocaust testimonies, words like survival and liberation, with their root meanings of life and freedom, entice us into a kind of verbal enchantment that too easily dispels the miasmas of the death camp ordeal and its residual malodors. Available vocabulary educes a unified view of the self, which invites us to adapt the Holocaust experience to ideas of heroism during the event and a process of recovery afterward that are inconsistent with the realities of the disaster. But there's also, I think, a generalized looking away in evidence, strange though that might sound, given the extent to which representations of the Holocaust pervade popular culture. This argument applies not just to saccharine treatments of the Holocaust, such as those found in popular books and films, but to the underpinnings of much Holocaust education and to pious ceremonies which characterize Holocaust commemoration. Tears may flow, but the truly destructive nature of the Holocaust for its victims and for the societies they came from, and the radical implications of the Holocaust for our modern world, are passed over in silence. So we must also remember that the Holocaust wasn't just a German affair. One of the roots, and I think this is one of the problems of commemoration today, I think that I'm talking about, one of the roots of the revival of fascism in Europe today can be found in the fact that the genocide of the Jews could not have been so thorough and so brutal without almost ubiquitous collaboration across Europe and beyond. Historians have long known this, but the true extent of this collaboration has remained covered up by successive governments across the continent. The drip feed of revelations and apologies means we still have not taken the measure of what truly happened in what can only be partly described as Hitler's Europe, but can truly be called anti-Semitic Europe in the period of World War II. So to give an example, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has, in recent years, begun a publishing project which is expected to run to 7 volumes, I think, an encyclopedia of camps and ghettos. Volumes 1 and 2, which are extraordinary resources, give details about camps and ghettos set up by the Germans. And volume 3 is about camps and ghettos set up by regimes aligned with Nazi Germany. So if you look at the map, you can see there's the Third Reich in its extended borders. None of the camps that we're familiar with, Dachau, Belsen, Mauthausen, etc., are on that map. All of these dots are camps set up by countries other than the Germans, across Europe and beyond, into North Africa, up to the far north of Scandinavia, the Channel Islands, and across here in particular, that conglomeration is Transnistria again. So this massive concentration of Holocaust sites established by the Romanians. So in this third volume of the encyclopedia, there are 900 pages containing information on almost 700 places, from the far north of Norway to the Atlas Mountains, from Brittany to Ukraine. Not a single one of them a camp administered by the Germans. Not all of them were Holocaust sites in the sense that Jews were sent there to die, but the majority had something to do with the Holocaust in the sense that Jews were held in many of them, not all of them, but in many of them, and died performing forced labor through serious neglect and lack of food and medicine, and through being deported from them to their deaths. So in, of course, a few famous cases like Drancy, the transit camp in just outside Paris, which is where the majority of the Jews deported from France were sent from, or from Fossoli di Capi, where most of the Jews deported from Italy were originally held. In some cases, as I mentioned in Transnistria, Jews were massacred in the tens of thousands or left to the elements to die a natural death. Not only do these places and events show that the post-war narrative of a German Holocaust is only partially correct, it also shows that the concept of industrial genocide, though certainly appropriate in part, fails to capture the experience of a large proportion of the Holocaust's victims. Almost half of the victims of the Holocaust died of starvation in ghettos or were shot in face-to-face killing actions, and even the gas chambers, and I'll come back to this shortly, were brutal and hardly the epitome of technological efficiency. The victims there in the gas chambers died in agony after having been terrorized, deported in unspeakably filthy means of transport, many driven insane before they even saw the entrance to a gas chamber. Indeed, if we talk about deportations from the furthest reaches of Europe, from Greece, for example, the deportation trains could take up to 2 weeks to arrive at Auschwitz, and the reports by those working at the camp all say half the people in them were already dead. So the trains that deported people to Auschwitz were themselves effectively mobile death camps. And that's something also that I think we tend to forget. So what I think this map shows is that the Holocaust was truly a transnational affair. By that I mean that policies implemented by the Nazis were replicated by their allies, but also vice versa. Often, collaborating states forced the hands of the Nazis by taking the initiative where persecution of Jews was concerned. The Vichy government, for example, preempted the Nazis by introducing its first Statut des Juifs, in October 1940 without the Nazis' encouragement. Persecution in one place emboldened others elsewhere, and the sharing of fascist ideology across Europe made this interconnectedness possible, facilitating a continent-wide crime that the Germans on their own would have found much harder to implement. The same is true from the victim's perspective. Historians are only just investigating in detail the experiences of Jews not directly caught in the Nazi net. The deportation and murder of the Jews of France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, Greece, and elsewhere has been described many times. Nevertheless, revelations continue to come, especially concerning the roles played by local non-German actors and the extent to which the Holocaust was experienced as a constant movement. Many Eastern European Jews were killed where they lived in the summer and autumn of 1941. Many others were rounded up and deported to their deaths, usually quite short distances, for example, from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. But the process of arrest, assembly, detention, deportation, travelling and arrival is often neglected. And for many Holocaust victims, the story was far more complicated, as they were dragged from one incarceration site to another. Some victims endured 5, 6 or more concentration camps, especially in the later stages of the war, when Jews were used as slave labourers in small sub-camps linked to specific firms which hired the so-called work Jews, Arbeitsjuden, from the SS. Additionally, historians are only now describing the fact that the Holocaust exceeded the boundaries of Europe. North Africa has been almost entirely omitted from most histories of the Holocaust, yet in the Vichy-controlled Maghreb and in areas occupied by the Germans and Italians, the persecution of the Jews forms part of the wider Holocaust story. Jews in North Africa were subjected to French and Italian racial laws, had their property stolen, and were interned and made to perform forced labour. Some, a small number, were deported to death camps in Europe, as were some North African Jews living in France. The growing research on the experiences of Jews in North Africa challenges our perception of where the Holocaust took place, making the designation of the genocide as a continent-wide crime, and that's a phrase I usually use as well without really thinking about it, but actually when we call it a continent-wide crime, if we think about North Africa, that term doesn't seem quite so adequate. Even if we say that the countries that we now think of as forming North Africa were at the time European colonies and thus in some ways part of Europe. Obviously for the French, Algeria was considered part of metropolitan France at the time with its 3 départements and so on. There were also several 100,000 Jews who fled or were deported from eastern Poland in the autumn of 1941 to spend the war years as refugees in the Soviet Union. Although they did not feel the full weight of Nazi occupation, their stories are also ones of massive loss of life. At the end of the war, the survivors returned to a country where they swiftly found that they could not stay because of ongoing anti-Semitism. Yet little is known about these Jews who spent the war years in the Soviet Union. Many of them fought in the Polish army and returned to Europe via Iran or elsewhere, and many others tell extraordinary stories of survival in Central Asia or Siberia, grateful to the Soviets for having saved their lives, but also having to fight against the Kafkaesque Soviet bureaucracy and restrictions on their rights. To give just one example, Maria Tumarkin's Aunt Lena, for example, was deported as a baby with her family from Kiev to Uzbekistan, where they all contracted malaria and tried to keep alive doing hard labor. Only a chance meeting between Lena's aunt, Tamara, with her former professor from the Kharkiv Medical Institute in Samarkand saved them, as they were sent to station Malyutinskaya to set up a medical station. Such chance occurrences were how many of the Polish Jewish refugees survived the harsh reality of the Soviet Union. Jews were dispersed around the world, from Mauritius to Japanese-occupied Manchuria, from Bolivia to the Philippines. Although Nazi-occupied Europe was the heart of the genocide, its effects were felt worldwide. So, although the persecution of the Jews that led to the Holocaust was a German project, I'm not trying to say otherwise. It's really important to say that this was a German-led project. It chimed with the programs of many European fascist and authoritarian regimes. Without the Germans' umbrella project, the Holocaust in Europe would not have happened. Nor were its allies as obsessed with the so-called world historical threat posed by the Jews as the leading Nazis were, although some came close, especially certain figures in the Croatian, Romanian, and French leadership stratum. But without the willing participation of so many collaborators across Europe, the Germans would have found it much harder to kill so many Jews. In Norway, France, and Hungary, local police rounded up, guarded, and deported Jews. In Slovakia, the impetus to deport Jews came from the indigenous clerical fascist regime rather than from the Germans. The same is true in the country of the Enlightenment, where French officials drafted the legislation and provided the manpower to arrest and deport Jews from France, the only country in Western Europe where Jews were deported from a zone not under direct German occupation, in other words, the South non-occupied zone. In the Romanian case, the regime of the conducător, the leader, Ion Antonescu, grasped the opportunity provided by the German plans to carry out a Holocaust of its own, deporting Jews from the recently annexed areas and killing them alongside Jews and Roma in Transnistria. So the scope of the killing implicates the whole of Europe, not just the Nazi regime and a few quislings. The legacy of collaborationist Europe remains visible in the resistance to research that appears from a nationalist perspective to defame the good name of the nation, as in the Polish government's attempts to prosecute historians who have uncovered information about Poles who handed Jews over to the Nazi occupiers. Instead, they prefer to sponsor research institutes which focus on the rescue of Jews, which also, of course, was part of the story, but very much a minority one in the Polish case. In the erection of memorials and the promotion of museums which selectively interpret the past so as to make one's nation appear an innocent victim or rescuer of Jews, as in controversial monuments recently created in Hungary, and most worryingly, in the ease with which increasingly large sections of the European populace reach for the store of ideas, images, and vocabulary associated with fascism, as, for example, in the association of migrants with criminality or disease. Many have interpreted the final solution as a mechanistic process, a plan for industrial genocide. I come back to this again. But this distracts us from what happened to most victims. The Jews killed in the Holocaust died in brutal face-to-face shootings, were starved to death in ghettos, or were murdered in death camps. But the prevailing notion of industrial genocide is not only a stock phrase which prevents us from thinking, it's not even accurate to describe a process that was violent, vicious, and deeply traumatic, whether one looks at the death pits of the Western Soviet Union or the extermination camps where the killing process could, at its height, be remarkably swift. The third thing I want to stress here is then the return, or what I call the return to ideology. Following the movement away from it in several recent major synthetic histories, for example, that of Christian Gerlach or David Cesarani, which stress instead the reactive nature of German decision-making, driven primarily by military circumstance. So in those books, what you see is the Holocaust being shaped primarily by the military situation. So depending on what's going on in the war, shapes the extent to which the Germans can put their hands on particular Jewish groups. And so when I talk about a return to ideology, I don't mean a simple intentionalist reading in which the Nazis murdered the Jews because they had always intended to do so, or in Daniel Goldhagen's reading because anti-Semitism, exterminationist anti-Semitism was somehow part of the Germans' genetic makeup. But what I'm talking about is a cultural imaginary in which the Nazis dreamed of a world without Jews long before they had a genocidal program in place to implement. So throughout the book, I draw on Nazi documents, of course, but also on diaries written during the Holocaust, post-war testimonies and records, and fiction, all of which, when used carefully, allow us to appreciate the terrible destruction caused by the Holocaust. Only a few scholars have combined scholarship with the emotions all too often, scholarship erects a barrier against feeling, forgetting the reasons why the Holocaust demanded our attention in the first place. This is a very difficult problem, I think, when writing about the Holocaust. We're taught as scholars to write in a dispassionate, objective fashion. And to a certain extent, I think that's right. When talking and writing about the Holocaust, there's no need to keep expressing one's revulsion or anger because the material speaks for itself. On the other hand, to write about something like this without allowing yourself to show that you're angry and upset and repelled is also strange, I think. And so to try and find the right balance and to negotiate that path is a challenge, and one that scholars, I think, need to think about a bit more. So to think about what I mean by a focus on ideology. Although there was no plan to murder the Jews of Europe before World War II, what became the Holocaust started as a genocidal fantasy long before the killing began. The Nazis had been dreaming, in Alon Confino's terms, of a world without Jews since the Nazi Party's inception. If you read the 1920 Nazi Party program, it's perfectly clear. But so too had many other European nation-states. The successors to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, slightly earlier creations such as unified Italy or Belgium, as well as longer established states such as France, all witnessed the emergence of large-scale nativist movements in the age of nationalism, whose dreams of creating ethnically pure nations chimed with the Nazi goals of eradicating Jews and other minority groups. The actual process of arriving at a genocidal program was in many ways ad hoc, and, as the recent scholarship suggests, heavily dependent on the military situation. Obviously, the Nazis could not deport Jews from countries they had not yet occupied, or from Axis countries whose leaders did not want to deport them, such as Italy before 1943 or Finland. Yet that doesn't mean that the murder of the Jews was an accident. Hatred, and more important, fear of Jews, was deeply ingrained into Nazi thinking. The Holocaust was not predetermined by an actual physical blueprint, but nor is it to read history backwards to say that the genocide of the Jews was foreshadowed in the writings, speeches, and actions of the Nazis from the 1920s onwards. So we need a renewed emphasis on Nazi ideology, in particular on race thinking in the broad sense, not just on race science, in fact I'd say particularly not on race science, but on the mysticism of race, in which Nazi thinkers set out a metaphysics and an anthropology of German superiority, and proposed that the movement of history was driven by a clash between good and evil, represented by the Germans on the one side, and the threatening race destroyers, the Jews or the Jew, on the other. One of the finest writers, interpreters of Nazism in the 1930s, Erich Voegelin, called Nazi race thinking a system of scientific superstition. I think that captures what's going on brilliantly. This kind of magical thinking covered with a veneer of supposedly scientific justification. These writings were echoed in race thinking across Europe. Irrespective of which country one examines, what these writings have in common was their demonization of the Jews. So ideology in this broad sense, not by which I don't simply mean then a consciously held political position, not a worked out political theory, but as a whole way of life, Weltanschauung, also ties in with Nazi fantasies about obtaining Lebensraum, or living space, in Eastern Europe, and creating a racial community, Volksgemeinschaft, in the Reich. These dreams actually went hand in hand. The notion of a unified and harmonious society of Aryans necessitated the removal of those deemed to block its coming into existence. In particular, this meant the Jews, for they were not merely aesthetically unpleasing marks of the community's imperfection, such as the disabled, but were, so the Nazis believed, actively seeking to destroy the Germans. So you can take each of these categories, anti-Semitism, empire, racial community, in turn, and analyze the ways in which they contributed to the unfolding of the Holocaust, but for the Nazis they were inseparable. A Nazi empire in the East replicating in Hitler's mind the British Empire in India, or more emphatically, the spread of white civilization across the expanding United States, was of necessity anti-Semitic, since the Nazis regarded Soviet communism as synonymous with Jews, so Judeo-Bolshevism, this term that continues to echo across Eastern Europe today. And the racial community at home was founded on the radical exclusion of Jews. Hence, ideology here means the very belief in an attempt to create an immanent community whose self-construction could only come about through genocidal destruction. This argument creates, to some extent, tension with my previous point about ubiquity. The focus on ideology, I think, reveals the difference between the Nazi regime and its collaborators. There's no doubting the anti-Semitic obsessions of leaders such as Tiso in Slovakia, Antonescu in Romania, or Horthy in Hungary, but they regarded Jews primarily as cunning competitors who prevented the titular nation from achieving its potential, not, as the leading Nazis did, as the incarnation of evil or as a kind of world-threatening metaphysical malignity. Collaboration in the Holocaust occurred for many reasons, nation-building, greed, and venality being the most obvious, but also, at a more grassroots level, fear, desperation, and avarice. As historian Peter Hayes writes, commenting on German corporate involvement in the Holocaust, if hatred was the fuel that propelled Nazi Germany on the road to the Holocaust, that road was paved not just by indifference, as Ian Kershaw has remarked, but by self-interest. Since the Holocaust was a German project first and foremost, which found willing collaborators everywhere, it's crucial to note how ideology, especially anti-Semitism, constituted a tacit or unspoken shared framework, a consensus or an offer that could be taken up by others. Besides, in all the countries occupied by Nazi Germany, as well as its allies, it's not hard to find viciously anti-Semitic texts and examples of collaborators whose ideological stance was closely aligned with Nazism. Collaboration was not merely opportunism. Finally, one of the things I stress in the book, and this is now a separate point again, is to remember that the Holocaust did not just end in May 1945 with the liberation of the camps. And I would refer you back to Langer's point that liberation is a very problematic term for thinking about what happened in the spring of 1945. Rather, the remnants of European Jewry, shocked and angry, found themselves, with the exception of the small numbers of Western European Jews who could return home relatively easily, homeless, without families, communities, or homelands. Jewish Poles who returned to Poland were subjected to pogroms. Hungarian Jews who returned were met with incredulity and disdain by those who had stolen their apartments. I think in this country people know this story as well. Dutch Jews encountered resistance to their stories since the Dutch were consumed with their own suffering during the hunger winter of 1944-45. And I think people here probably know all about the ways in which surviving Jews in 1945-46 were told that they should be grateful to be back home amongst the Dutch population who'd done so much to care for them and to basically to shut up. The creation of displaced persons camps in, of all places, Germany and Austria, and to a smaller extent in Italy, and the incarceration of Jewish illegal migrants in Cyprus by the British left many Jewish survivors with a feeling that there was no future for them anymore in Europe. Having expected help from the Allies to resettle where they wanted, their bitter disappointment at being detained further manifested itself in a knee-jerk Zionism. Although some half of all survivors eventually found their way to the US, Palestine became the destination of choice for most, at least in the first instance. And the creation of the State of Israel, in the context of a war in which a large proportion of soldiers were Holocaust survivors, followed in a sequence of events that might otherwise never have come to pass. In the decades that followed, the memory of the Holocaust continued to be felt in world affairs. Civil rights and anti-apartheid struggles, anti-colonialism, wars in Algeria and other colonies. Memories of collaboration, fascist interpretations of history, and anti-fascism were all mobilized in ways that made for a complex and in some cases toxic brew. In Israel, the resistance fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto were regarded as forerunners of the IDF and the militarized stance of the new state. The 1953 creation of Yad Vashem, Israel's memorial and research center, unsurprisingly placed the Holocaust at the heart of the new state's self-perception. This was the instinctive Zionism of the DPs, rejected by Europe and the US, in action. It would take several decades for the events which accompanied the creation of the State of Israel, especially the Nakba or Palestinian catastrophe, when Palestinians were expelled from their towns and villages to make way for Jewish settlers, to make its mark on Israeli intellectuals and the public. In the student revolts of 1968 across Europe and the Americas, the memory of the Holocaust was instrumentalized as a way of criticizing the older generations, often in ways which suggested that the students themselves, for all their anti-fascist credentials, had failed to understand the real horror of the Holocaust. This is most infamously illustrated in the hijacking of an Air France plane en route from Israel to France in 1976. Landing at Entebbe in Uganda, the West German and Palestinian hijackers selected Jewish and Israeli passengers as hostages while the rest were set free. In this action, the failure to work through their parents' fascism was clear. It constituted, I quote, a compulsive repetition of Nazi crimes by those who had tried to distance themselves from them. And that's student leader Joschka Fischer, later prominent politician in the Federal Republic. So there was then a Holocaust effect in international politics, intergenerational struggles and geopolitical crises, even before Holocaust consciousness became prominent through commemoration, education, and representation. So, for example, debates about reparations payments from West Germany to Israel in 1950, the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in 1963, 64, etc., etc. There were many way stations of Holocaust memory. When Ronald Reagan visited Bitburg Cemetery in May 1985, it allowed the Ramones to write one of their better tracks. But apart from that, Holocaust survivors led by Elie Wiesel expressed their outrage, especially when it was discovered that SS men were buried there alongside ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, as if it was okay to pay homage to the Wehrmacht. And since then, I think there's Holocaust-related stuff somehow in the news practically every day now. And so there's a kind of unstoppable barrage of Holocaust representations, with some critics arguing that just about all of them, from beer bottles labelled with fascist leaders, I think this one comes from Italy, to cats that look like Hitler website, Kittlers, from computer games to scholarly debates about comparative genocide, are all trivializations of the subject. I'm not saying this is not a trivialization of the subject, but what I would say is that this very proliferation of representations actually shows just how successful, in some ways, Holocaust consciousness has been. The images of the camps and other Holocaust iconography are instantly recognizable. So, a few words of conclusion. Getting this history right means putting an end to the sanitizing of the Holocaust. The idea of bureaucratic genocide, I think, is curiously mind-numbing, shielding us from the true horror of what took place. The torture faced by the Eastern European victims in being rounded up and shot outside of their hometowns, or being driven insane by starvation in the ghettos of Nazi-occupied Poland, or of waiting in line to be murdered by primitive gas chambers driven by malfunctioning internal combustion engines at the Reinhard camps, is missing from many accounts, both scholarly and popular. Auschwitz is rightly remembered as, in the words of one historian, the capital of the Holocaust. But it was the end point of a genocidal history that had already seen millions of Jews murdered in the most brutal ways imaginable, a process that was ideologically driven. So, although the Nazis placed great store on what I call race mysticism, this wasn't an atavistic regression, but it was a response to a modern crisis. By attacking the Jews as a symbol of modernity, the Nazis left in place much that caused the crisis in the first place, especially the rampant nature of unregulated interwar capitalism, which led to the Great Depression. Instead, focusing discontent on what one critic calls a personification of its social form. It wasn't an accident that the Nazis focused their hatred on the Jews. Jews were the traditional other of the Christian West, both constituent of Western civilization and a reminder of that which was supposed to be overcome. Christian European history had periodically reenacted the crucifixion through ritual murders and pogroms of Jews. As one strident critic puts it, the Holocaust exposes the pulsation of an unconscious behavioral cliché transferred to the secular religion of Nazism, which reenacted it systematically. In its modern variant, anti-Semitism was a projection onto an other whose outsider-insider status needed no explanation, of fears brought about by conditions that were thoroughly modern in origin. In the words of the great Holocaust historian Saul Friedlander, the very notion of outsider applied by modern anti-Semitism to the Jew owed its tenacity not only to Jewish difference as such, but also to the depth of its religious roots. It was, he says, a reactivated millenarian phantasm built on the deep psychology of European fantasies as applied to a modern crisis. So what we see in the Holocaust, as Friedlander succinctly puts it, is the use of bureaucratic measures to enforce magical beliefs. Again, back to Fergelin, a system of scientific superstition. If much the same is true today, the radical right attacks immigrants, Muslims, others of all varieties, thereby mistaking a symbol for the concrete, then saying so is not about using present-day problems to explain the past. Instead, it's the reverse. It shows how the appeal of Nazism could lead to the commission of a crime that exceeds the cognition of the rational mind, even in our supposedly modern, rational, bureaucratic societies. Historians sometimes shy away from offering explanations, preferring to detail the mechanics of how something occurred. This is especially so when the explanations tend toward the psychoanalytical or toward other factors which cannot easily be backed up empirically. But the need to try is not outweighed by the obvious truth that any explanation will only ever be partial, suggestive, and a spur to further thinking. It's easy to feel bamboozled and overwhelmed in the face of the horror of the Holocaust, and no book can be the last word on the subject, as is of course true for all subjects. But in the case of the Holocaust, it's perhaps especially apt that history should be unfinished. The idea of endless questioning and an openness to new ideas operates as a logical counterweight to the desire for final solutions, last words, and completion. Today, the heirs of the Red Army, in a remarkable inversion and cynical exploitation of the anti-fascist victory over the Third Reich, are bombarding Ukraine in the name of liberating that country from Nazism. Putin's belief that Ukraine is not a real country echoes Hitler's views about Poland. For Holocaust historians, this manipulation of memory is nothing new. But what is shocking is the way in which long-standing memory wars have fueled a real war. Nazism, the Holocaust, and their legacies continue to be fought over in contemporary Europe and beyond. We should at least be clear about the events themselves of 80 years ago if we're to have any hope of making sense of the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stone, for this, well, I must say, thought-provoking and, well, impressive lecture. I have one question. So you described very clearly the process of continent-wide anti-Semitism, and you talked about fantasies, about dreams applied to modern crisis. Is there a parallel with today? You were talking about outsider, insider view. Is there a kind of parallel, or is it something completely different?
I mean, that's what I was trying to hint at the end.
In the end, yes.
Yeah, I mean, there is a parallel because that kind of thinking, I don't think it's simply scapegoating, but it's an attempt to explain a genuine problem in the world, but mistaking a symptom for an analysis or an explanation. And so where the Jew was figured as a symptom of modernity, rootlessness, cosmopolitanism, soullessness, dislocation, and so on, I think today the same is often true about Muslims in Western Europe and migrants, whether Muslim or not. The difference is, of course, that Nazi Germany took this race thinking to the very heart of the state and everything it did. And so today this problem exists, but it's a problem confined to particular movements, particular newspapers, particular groups, certain voting patterns and so on. Even where there have been far-right groups entering into or coming close to entering into government in Austria, in Sweden and Denmark and elsewhere, that we don't see the same taking this issue as the kind of guiding principle for everything that the state does. It's very different in that sense. I don't want to minimize the threats, but I also don't want to say it's just the same and be alarmist about it, because there is a difference as well.
Okay, thank you. If there are any questions, raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone. Here's a question. Yes, you have a map.
Okay. Well, I don't really understand the map, in fact. Mm-hmm. So I don't understand how to interpret it. Not this one?
This one?
This one, yes. Because, so the title is Camps and Ghettos under Regimes Aligned with Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. So I have two questions, in fact. The first is which countries are aligned and which not. That's not very clear to me. And the second is, if you say camps and ghettos under regimes aligned with Nazi Germany, you don't include Germany itself. And if I look at the card, it's Germany already expanded over Poland. Mm-hmm. So that is my question. How to, is it just that Germany isn't count as aligned with Nazi Germany because it's Nazi Germany itself?
Yes, in short, yes, that's exactly right. That the map does not include sites in Germany because it's not aligned, because it is Germany, not aligned with Germany, exactly as you say. So you did understand it, I think, perfectly clearly. But the first point, I think, is a bit more complicated. I think the idea of the map is that each of the dots on the map shows a camp or a ghetto set up by a regime aligned with Nazi Germany. And there you can say, okay, that's perfectly clear in the case of France, or Italy, or Romania, or Bulgaria. In other cases, it's a bit more ambiguous. So in the case of Greece, for example, there are several sites included there. But under this definition, I'm not sure I would include Greece as aligned with Nazi Germany. Greece was occupied by Nazi Germany, which is why I think the Netherlands is not included in this, because obviously there were camps like Westerbork and Vught and so on created in this country, but this was not a regime aligned with Nazi Germany. It was an occupied country. And I would say the same is true of Greece. It was an occupied country. So why it appears here is a bit harder to explain, I think. There was a collaborationist government, like there was in the Netherlands, but I think it's a fair point. So I would only say, I mean, this is not something I was involved in, but the work that has gone into creating the USHMM encyclopedias is really breathtaking. They're phenomenal resources, and there are entries on places that you've never heard of. And there are, amongst the places here, there's probably a handful of camps that most people might have heard of. Drancy, the Risiera di San Saba in Trieste, Jasenovac outside Zagreb, and so on. And the rest are unknown. And some of them are so unknown that even the writers in the encyclopedia just list, in a few cases they just list them and say we couldn't find any, we just know these places exist and we can't really find anything out about them. And the first 2 volumes about the camps in Germany itself, in the Third Reich itself, are also, even though these are well-known sites, it's a phenomenal enterprise because they also write about all of the sub-camps attached to the main camps and point the way to further research, to all the sources that they've used and where to find them and so on. So I would say we can probably forgive them the fact that to some extent it's a little bit confusing, but I think you're right that you put your finger on a problem that's not very clear. And all I would say is the volume is free to download from the US HMM website. Have a read of the introduction and maybe that will clarify things, but thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I actually have a question. You mentioned that this was a system of scientific superstition quite a number of times, and maybe after your research, just wanting to point to how Nazi ideology points to this belief that the Aryan race is better than the others, than the Jews, right? And so I was thinking, you also mentioned that for these Allied forces, they really looked into, how do you say it? They wanted more space. They wanted it, you mentioned, it was mostly self-interest. It was a road not paved by indifference, but mostly by self-interest. So maybe, I know that the Nazis also used this, their ideology to sort of justify getting more space, living room, as you said. But after your research, how much do you think, percentage-wise, is it really in these sort of reasons that they did what they did, or is it really that belief, the superstition that really there is a race better than others? Because I do think that, I don't think that everybody, there are certain ideologies, but there are certain ideologies that are just so insane to really believe 100%, and I was just wondering, how is it that one man can really just spur this whole phenomenon and make this whole, even like those who are not under Germany, but like Romania, as you said, completely, not completely, but mostly on their own massacres, deaths, and yeah, just, is it really this ideology of us versus others, or is it just self-interest? Which weighs more? Okay,
it's a brilliant question, thank you very much. And first of all, the fact that an ideology is insane is not a reason to think that people can't believe it. In fact, it's probably the more insane it is, the more seriously we should probably take it as thinking, you know, if people are saying this, they probably mean it. That would be one of the lessons of the misinterpretation of Mein Kampf from the 1930s, for example, where everybody said, yeah, the guy's crazy and he doesn't mean it, and once he has to negotiate with regular politicians across the world, he'll calm down. And it was a massive misreading. But secondly, I think your point is really spot on, because I would say that ideas about self-interest, about venality and so on, apply to the majority of, I wouldn't say perpetrators, but those on the perpetrator side in the Holocaust. So Ukrainian peasants who stole stuff from their neighbors' houses after they'd been murdered, say, because the Jews, you know, were a tiny bit richer than their extremely poor neighbors, and so they might have stolen some pots and pans and blankets. I think that a very small minority in Germany believed this insane stuff, but the problem is they were the people in charge. Okay, so what I think is the case is that Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, Eichmann's men in 4B4 in the Gestapo, the intellectuals of the SD, the heads of the Einsatzgruppen, some of the leadership stratum of the order police, etc., they were the true believers in this nonsense. And it then didn't matter whether everybody else really believed it or not. Everybody else took part for one reason or another. But I think when you read not just Hitler's speeches, but when you read the works of Nazi philosophers like Bäumler or Krieg or Klages or others, you see, on the one hand, something insane, but you also see these were serious, in most cases, serious intellectuals, university professors. Krieg was the rector of, or a chair in philosophy at Heidelberg or wherever it was, and who wrote these tracts saying, we don't need the scientists to back up our theories of race. We adhere to these theories of race because we want to believe they're true. I mean, who the hell thinks like that? But these were the people who held the reins of power. That's what really mattered, I think. So I'm not, of course, not making an argument a la Goldhagen that says all Germans everywhere wanted to kill Jews. I don't think that's true for a moment. But I do think that what was crucial here is that the people who made the decisions did believe it.
I will come to you one moment. First you.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that very much at the beginning how the culture of memorial and is focusing very much on the individual and maybe family level, but not so much on the level of the state. And I think at the European level we see similar things when some countries are pushing to make Holocaust Remembrance Day bigger, but then there's also the movement in Central and Eastern Europe to then also include the day of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So how do we remember better without sort of trivializing these experiences?
It's a really good question and a really difficult one. I'm not sure I have the answer. But with respect to memory debates, I suppose, or memory competitions or competitions for victimhood, which is sort of implied in what you're saying about the reaction to Holocaust Memorial Day coming from some of the Eastern European countries, particularly the Baltic states, is to say there should be enough memory to go round. It's not a zero-sum game where if we commemorate the Holocaust, we can't commemorate the victims of Stalinism, or vice versa. But I think the problem with the negative reaction coming from Eastern Europe was the fact that it's built not so much on a desire to simply commemorate the victims of Stalin, but also to emphasize the sufferings of the nations in Eastern Europe above the Holocaust, and thereby to downplay local involvement in the Holocaust. So we have this double genocide theory, where first of all there was the genocide of the Jews under German occupation, no mention of course of local collaborationists in Lithuania or Latvia or wherever, and then followed the much longer period of the genocide of the Latvian, Hungarian, Romanian people under Stalin. And by the way, who was responsible for bringing communism to Latvia, Hungary, wherever? It was the Jews. And so you have this rhetoric which ostensibly is built on a kind of commemoration of the suffering of the Jews, but actually instrumentalizes that suffering in order to make one's own nation look, first of all, heroic, and B, as having suffered much more. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I do know that we'll never get there unless this kind of competition for suffering is put aside. And there have been efforts within the EU and beyond to create narratives that satisfy different competing sides, but of course they tend to be very bland and not say a great deal. But I think that there has to be awareness on the part of all parties that not only one group has suffered in modern Europe, but nevertheless, you have to be able to make distinctions. So I remember giving a talk in Bucharest a few years ago, and at the end the students in the group were saying, "Yeah, but which was worse, Nazism or communism?" This is what it came down to in the end. Which was worse? And I think and I have an answer to that, but you have to. It's not really the only way of thinking about this.
Thank you very much as well for the interesting lecture. I've got a question because I've been doing a bit of research on Serbia and their use of memory inversion, I guess and I think that links into a bit of Judeo-Bolshevism, which they were referring to. Could you maybe please just outline or explain the concept again of Judeo-Bolshevism, because I think it's a bit of a weird one. Weird one to wrap my head around, and also, I guess, for me, I struggle to understand why memory politics is such a big thing in dual-occupied countries, in that case of Serbia, obviously under Nazism and then under communism. And I guess, yeah, the impact of memory politics and this distortion or manipulation, in how the Holocaust is viewed today.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot of very big questions there. So,
wow.
Judeo-Bolshevism is, I think, a term that comes. A lot of this stems back to the period of the turn of the 20th century, the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this Tsarist era conspiracy theory about this cabal of Jews that are secretly running the world and holding the puppet strings behind all the world's politicians and movements, and so on, from capitalism to communism and so on. But the reason why it was so successful was because it was spread by Russian exiles after the revolution, particularly. So you have this very influential text and a very influential community spreading it abroad. So at the time of the Balfour Declaration, for example, 1917, one of the reasons why what can be read as, from a Zionist narrative, as the generosity of the British government and the sympathy with the Jewish plight and so on, a stronger argument for why the Balfour Declaration was issued is that because the British government believed in this international power of the Jews and thought that this would be a way of currying favour and interpreting the so-called power of the international Jewish world conspiracy, right? There's quite a lot of literature on that written, about the Jews in World War I and so on. And so this concept of Judeo-Bolshevism comes from the period of the Russian Revolution itself. It's not invented by the Nazis. Most things are not invented by the Nazis. They simply radicalized them. And so in the case of, Serbia is kind of an unusual case, as is Yugoslavia in general. But across Eastern Europe, in the countries that formed the Eastern Bloc after 1945, or after the Warsaw Pact was signed, those are countries, first of all, with limited experience of democracy, where the emancipation of the Jews had been, in most cases, forced by other powers. For example, after the Congress of Berlin in 1878, the Western powers forcing the Romanians to sign up to minority rights and so on, and where Jews, because of their social position and the lack of emancipation and Jewish nationalist movements and Bundism and so on, Jews in especially parts of Poland and Belarus and Ukraine formed a kind of middleman community, classic, like the Chinese in Indonesia, or many, many other examples you can think of. And so the Jews formed this kind of barrier between the more or less illiterate peasantry and the aristocracy in countries with a very small middle class. And so, Jews are artisans, innkeepers, cattle dealers, etc., marginally wealthier than their neighbours, easy to breed resentment against, and in countries with traditional religious beliefs still very strong, where Jews are figured as Christ killers, both in Catholic and Orthodox countries like Serbia. All of these connections added together create a kind of explosive mixture. The Nazis exploit this absolutely, because Hitler's conspiracy theory is about the Jews, not about Bolshevism. He hates the communists insofar as he thinks it's a Jewish creation, not the other way around, I think, as some historians have claimed. And so that, I think, we could go on and on, but this is not a lecture about the history of Judeo-Bolshevism, right? You have a look at the book on the subject by Hanebrink. It's very, is it Hanebrink? Anyway, I'll find the reference. But Serbia is an interesting case because, of course, during the war, Serbia was occupied by the Germans, and the Serbs were victims of the Croats. So in the independent state of Croatia, the NDH, the largest victim group of the Ustasha regime in Croatia was not Jews but Serbs. The Croats killed far more Serbs than they did Jews because they had this goal of racial purification. They created a kind of Nuremberg laws equivalent for the Jews in Croatia, making them wear a Z for Židov on their fronts and backs and so on. But they killed far more Serbs because they wanted to get the Serbs out of the country. And I think probably what your question also implies the echo of that in the wars of Yugoslav succession in the 1990s. And you see when you see what you see representing the inversion is the Serbian rhetoric in the 1990s that the Serbs have to invade Croatia because otherwise they're going to be victims of Croatian genocide. And of course, in the 1990s, the opposite was the case, but I think the wars in the 1990s were, in many respects, a kind of memory war rerun of Chetniks versus Ustasha 2 generations later. Despite the rhetoric of brotherhood and unity in Yugoslavia, every family knew who was a Croat and who was a Serb. And those fault lines were very easy to activate in the kind of power vacuum after the collapse of the regime.
Yes, in the back.
Hello, thank you, Professor Stone, for such a heartbreaking presentation. And I'm from Kyrgyzstan, and my great-grandfather is a hero of the Great Patriotic War. So it's a very interesting topic for me. And now that you've mentioned the state of Israel, I'd like to just know your stance on the view that the Western world's guilt towards horrible atrocities towards the Jews is one of the main reasons for the formation of state Israel. What do you think of this view?
No, I think that Western, particularly German, guilt about the past continues to influence the way in which European governments don't speak out as much as they should about the state of Israeli politics. If the current Netanyahu government had just been elected to power in the Netherlands, there would be justifiable outcries and outrage about it. But in the Israeli case, I won't say they get a free pass, but the different circumstances appear to allow for different judgments to prevail. And I said no to your question because I simply think the geopolitical realities of the time owed more to the creation of the State of Israel than anything else. That's to say that there was a short-term coincidence whereby both the Soviets and the Americans were taking an anti-British imperial position that made it impossible. Britain was basically bankrupt after World War II, couldn't really afford to maintain the empire anymore, and the anti-imperial stance of the Soviets and the Americans, particularly the Americans who were funding the UK, made it, I think, impossible for the British to hold on to Palestine. I think that's much more. The British did all they could to stop Holocaust survivors from reaching Palestine. So I don't think guilt was really the solution, the answer at that particular moment in time.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for your compelling and thought-provoking lecture. I have a question, and it's about Ukraine. Related to what you said, that in Eastern European countries, their role is being downplayed and is shifted towards this Judea Bolshevism story. Well, Ukraine wasn't a country in those days. It was a Soviet republic, and in the 30s, the 1930s, the Holodomor took place in Ukraine, taking approximately 3 to 7 million lives, nobody knows, including Ukrainian Jews. And then in August 1941, the Nazi Germany armies marched into Ukraine. Ukrainians saw them as liberators. And also Nazi Germany was feeding this story about Judea Bolshevism. How then, on a scale from downplaying to real serious, should this story then be seen, the story of the Ukrainians, that they were in a certain way then also collaborating?
I think it's simply a question that has to be handled with sensitivity. I think the war, Putin's war on Ukraine, forced a lot of Holocaust historians to think quite carefully about what they say, because most Holocaust historians, including those who work specifically on Ukraine, are quite used to thinking about Ukrainians as collaborators, as murderers of the Jews. The OUN, Bandera, etc., the people who, at least for a time, thought that the Nazis were going to be liberators and grant them a Ukrainian nation state. Obviously, they were disabused of that notion quite quickly, but in the meantime, they took part in the murders of tens of thousands of Jews. There's no doubt about it. And so I think for a lot of Holocaust historians, when they heard Putin talking about eradicating Nazism in Ukraine, it had an echo, a kind of ring of truth about it. But you have, I think, to be very careful to separate Ukraine 80 years ago from Ukraine today. There are, of course, neo-Nazi movements in Ukraine, but there are everywhere in Europe. And there's no evidence, I think, to say that in Ukraine they wield any more influence than they do anywhere else in Europe. So Same was talking about the Great Patriotic War, for example, or the Soviets as liberators. There's no reason why we shouldn't continue to talk about what was historically the case. It doesn't predetermine what we think is about what is going on in the present.
Okay, we have to end this evening. So thank you all for your high level of questions and for the discussion. Thank you again for the lecture. We have one upcoming lecture on the 13th of February by Miriam Rush. It's about autonomy in the age of digitization. Sorry. So please join us the next time at Studienhalle. Please give him one big round of applause.
Thank you very much.